Hello, mathematicians. Today we're going to be learning about fractions and decimals, more specifically about comparing mixed numbers and decimals by converting to decimals. To get us started, we have 6 and 2 over 5, and we have 6 and 3/10. Now, notice that both whole numbers are the same, which makes it difficult to compare. And one of them is a mixed number and the other is a decimal, making it even more difficult to compare. So we're going to make sure that both of these are decimals to make it a little bit easier to compare. Now, 6 and 3/10 already is, so we're going to take 6 and 2 over 5 and convert it in decimal form. So we're just going to work with the fraction for right now and ignore the whole number. So we're going to take 2 and divide it by 5. So we're dividing the numerator by the denominator. And then we ask ourselves, how many times does 5 go into 2? Well, it doesn't, so we're going to put a 0 here. And then we're going to add a decimal point after the 2 and a 0. Make sure you bring up that decimal point. And then we're going to ask ourselves, how many times does 5 go into 20? When we ask ourselves this, we're going to ignore the decimal that's here. Well, 5 goes into 20 4 times, and that's because 5 times 4 is equal to 20. So we're going to write that number down here, and then we're going to subtract these two values. 20 minus 20 is 0, so there's no remainder. That means that 2 over 5 is equal to 4/10. But here we have 6 and 2 over 5, which means that 6 and 2 over 5 is equal to 6 and 4/10. Here we have 6 and 3/10. So our two values are 6 and 4/10 and 6 and 3/10. Now in the ones place, they both have 6, but in the tenths place, one has 4 and one has 3, which means that 6 and 4/10 is greater than 6 and 3/10. That also means that 6 and 2 over 5 is greater than 6 and 3/10. So here we have 8 and 31 over 50 and 8 and 62/100. Now this one's already a decimal, so we're going to take our mixed number and convert it to a decimal. We're only going to start off by working with the fractions, so 31 over 50, which means 31 divided by 50. We take our numerator and divide it by our denominator in order to get the decimal. Then we ask ourselves, how many times does 50 go into 3? Well, it doesn't. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 50 go into 31? And again, it doesn't, so we're going to put a 0 there. Then add a decimal point after the 1 and add another 0. So first we bring up our decimal point, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 50 go into 310? Remember, ignore the decimal point when you ask yourselves that, and that would be 6, because 50 times 6 is equal to 300, and that's as close as we could get without passing 310. So we're going to write our 300 right below and then subtract. 310 minus 300 is equal to 10. Now there's still a remainder, so let's add a 0 and see what happens. We're going to bring that 0 down. Now we ask ourselves, how many times does 50 go into 100? Well, 50 goes into 100 2 times because 50 times 2 is equal to 100. So we're going to add the 100 on the bottom and then go ahead and subtract. 100 minus 100 is equal to 0. So 31 over 50 is equal to 62/100. So 8 and 31 over 50 is equal to 8 and 62/100. So we're going to write that down there. And then we're going to take 8 and 62/100 here, bring it down. Notice how they are exactly the same, meaning they are equivalent, which means that 8 and 31 over 50 is equal to 8 and 62/100. So next we have 7 and 5 over 6 and 7 and 8/10. Now we're going to make sure they're both decimals. This one already is. So we're going to take 7 and 5 over 6. We're specifically going to take just the fraction, 5 over 6, and divide the numerator divided by the denominator. And ask ourselves, how many times does 6 go into 5? Well, 6 does not go into 5. So we're going to add a 0. And so we're going to add a decimal point after the 5, and then add another 0. Make sure you bring up the decimal point, and then ask yourselves, how many times does 6 go into 50? Well, 6 goes into 50 8 times, and that's because 6 times 8 is equal to 48. We're going to put the 48 underneath the 50, and then we're going to go ahead and subtract. 50 minus 48 is equal to 2. So because we have a remainder, we're going to go ahead and add another 0 and see what happens. And now we have 20. So we ask ourselves, how many times does 6 go into 20? Well, 6 goes into 20 3 times because 6 times 3 is equal to 18. We're going to go ahead and add 18 here and then subtract. 20 minus 18 is 2. So we bring down another 0 and get 20 again. So 6 goes into 20 3 times because 6 times 3 is equal to 18. So if we subtract, we're going to go ahead and get 2 again. So that means that this is going to keep repeating. It's going to be 0.83333 and so forth. So we could rewrite that as 0.83 with a line on top of the 3 showing that it's going to keep repeating. All right? So 7 and 5 over 6 is equal to 7.83 with a line on top of the 3. And then we're going to write that down over here. So 7.833 ... meaning it keeps going. And then 7.8 on the bottom to make it easier to compare. And where we have missing values, we could just add zeros as a place value holder. And if we look at the ones place, it's the same. If we look at the tenths place, it's the same. But here, 3 is greater than 0, meaning that this one is greater than 8 tenths. So that means that 7 and 5 over 6 is greater than 7 and 8 tenths. Here we have our final example, 7 and 7 over 40. And we have 7 and 1800ths. Now, this one's already a decimal, so we're going to go ahead and convert this to a decimal. So we're only going to focus with the fraction right now. So 7 over 40, which is 7 divided by 40. We ask ourselves, how many times does 40 go into 7? Well, it doesn't, so we add a 0. We add a decimal point after the 7 and add another 0. Make sure you bring the decimal point up, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 40 go into 70? 40 goes into 70 one time because 40 times 1 is equal to 40, and that's as close as we could get without going over. 70 minus 40 is equal to 30. Let's add another 0, bring it down, and then we ask ourselves, how many times does 40 go into 300? And well, that would be 7 times because 40 times 7 is equal to 280, and that's as close as we could get without going over. So we're going to subtract 300 minus 280, and we're going to get 20. Now we're going to add another 0. Make sure we bring it down, and then ask ourselves, how many times does 40 go into 200? Well, that would be 5 times because 40 times 5 is equal to 200. So when we subtract now, we don't get a remainder. And 7 over 40 is equal to 175 thousandths, which means that 7 and 7 over 40 is equal to 7 and 175 thousandths. So we're going to write that down there. And we're going to write 7 and 1800ths. Now, if we look at the ones place for both, they both have a 7. If we look at the tenths place, they both have a 1. But here, in the hundredths place, this one has a 7, but this one has an 8, meaning that 7 and 175 thousandths is less than 7 and 18 hundredths. And that's it.